generation must, out of relative obscurity, define its mission, either fulfill it or betray it. Let me invite Dr. Momani to give us some remarks.
Thank you very much to the facilitator of this very important discussion in the country, and allow me to join my colleagues on the table here, extending our appreciation to the Dr. John Langeli Dube Institute for organizing these roundtable discussions. And for inviting us from the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. Though coming from an academic background like my colleagues here, today I'm going to make my input as a monitor of the performance of government on land reform in particular. That as we deal with this very important question of the terms of negotiation around the sunset clause, what are the implications for future generations in the country, whether we'll be able to stand with a straight face explaining to our children why we agreed to the cut-off date of 19 June 1913. I think it's important for us to be very clear on what the obligations of the country are in this regard, in terms of proving our commitment to land reform through better performance on the claims that have already been lodged, ensuring that there are adequate resources that will enable us to achieve on the aspirations of redistributing land to the disadvantaged. So, Mr. Gule, in his opening remarks, actually cited a comment by the Chief Justice that the land issue is highly complex and perplex. I want to add that it's a very emotional issue, as we picked up from various members in the panel, including the chairperson, that each one of us has some connection and association to the land. The reasons, as outlined by Dr. Tong, of why this the property clause was tightened in the manner that it was, it's because it links directly to the ability or the foundation for releasing the economic power of South Africans overall, particularly Black South Africans. So, within this limitation of the 19th of June as the cut-off date, we opened, I'll say, the restitution program within the first 5 years of the democratic government that closed 31st December. We know one of the complexities of that period was the fact that not many people were informed of what they need to do. As a result, only just about 80,000 claims were lodged. What is the level of performance on the claims that have already been lodged? Okay. What are the backlogs? I think we need to deal with these questions in terms of what informs the difficulties or the complexity for the country to clear those backlogs. We know it's estimated at around 77,419 backlogs in that first batch of claims. The reality is the level of buy-in from all players in the country, the commercial, agriculture, people that benefited from the dispossession program is questionable. We need to move beyond looking at land reform as a government-led program, but look at it as a societal, as a problem that society as a whole has to deal with, including an acknowledgement by the white commercial beneficiaries of dispossession that if we don't do something about that, the young people as represented by the August doctor here are going to ask us a question that we won't be able to answer a few years down the line. So for us to build this strong mobilization, advocacy for the whole of society to rally around a possible amendment of the Constitution, it's important that we prove ourselves by successfully dealing with the claims already lodged at a pace that is satisfactory to the citizenry in the country. The second issue relates to second issue around the complexity relates to the manner of settlement, the manner of finalization. If we think land is a critical component for transformation, a critical asset base for economic growth in the country, we need to ensure that land reform results in transfer or redistribution of land. Currently, let me just give you some figures. It's a nature of monitoring. We speak based on evidence. Just focusing on the first claims that were lodged in 1998, December. We know that a majority of those claims, the nature of settlement was in the form of financial compensation. There are valid reasons for that to happen. But in some cases, financial compensation is put forward as a preferred option. Why? Because of what the NDP articulates as the challenges around unemployment, around poverty, around inequality, and all that. So the choice for land as enshrined, or the right to land as enshrined in the Constitution, is kind of withheld for the younger generations because of adults or parents taking a decision to accept financial compensation. 2 days ago, we were having a discussion on this matter, and officials from the commission shared with us that the maximum they can pay an individual claimant is around 110,000, which is nothing compared to the value of the land. I think we have to deal with this matter if we want to return ownership, to restore dignity of South Africans, to protect the future of generations, young people in the country. We need to deal with the modalities around settlement of land. Let me leave it here as an input by saying that it's important that we successfully deal with what is on the table currently and use that as a base for mobilization for an amendment to the Constitution. Thank you.
The maiden debate that the John Langalibalele Dube Institute hosted in UKZN was mainly political parties. Their representatives were equivocal in saying that the date in the Constitution does not serve the spirit of the Constitution. Especially if one considers that it is now 2016. Our Constitution was adopted in 1996. We have tried all sorts of interventions for 20 years. As you rightfully say, land reform has to become a societal issue. Society can no longer be passive on such a topical matter. We cannot just leave it to government and see it as a government program. The preamble of our constitution says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. It has to be an issue that affects all of us. The timeline of South Africa, South Africa can be divided into a number of periods or epochs, if you like. The period up to 1652, that is the first epoch of this country. The second is the period from 1652. It's a very popular date. I think all of us know that we had a landing of a very famous Dutch man called Jan van Riebeeck, 1652 to 1800. That is the next epoch. The next one is 1800 until 1930. Then 1913 to 1994 and 1994 to 2016. In all of these periods, a lot of things happened. Now, what I would like our panelists to just bite on, as I also invite all of you that are here to prepare remarks or questions relating to this matter. Should there even be a date in the Constitution to limit the redress? Now, I want you to think about this question from the time.
Thank you. Am I still mic'd? I hope.
It looks like technology is defeating us a bit.
Is it green? No. It goes on and on. Wait. I think what is being asked for, and the way I read the move or the move towards rethinking 19 June 1913 is essentially a question that says dispossession of land rights in South Africa is so fundamental and really goes to the essence and the being of who we are as a country. And the fact that what it has led to, it runs so deep, and it is not possible that you can just say that you will only limit it to 19 June 1913. The way I understand, at least at the time I was a master's student reading and following the discussions at CODESA, and when they were discussing the final constitution and what it should say, the way I understood at the time at least, and indeed I understand very well, the point that says perhaps it's time to review, and the young people are asking the questions, was what was decided in 1996, is it still relevant, is it appropriate? I'll just touch on what was the move to, or what motivated the need to have a cutoff point. At the time the discussion was, yes, there is need to have transformation and have redress and do what is required to, if South Africa post-apartheid is going to be a just and equitable society, as the Constitution says. But there was also anxiety about if you do not have a limit, and I'm not saying in order to say this is, it's the right, just to reflect on what had been the motivation of the at the time, is that you needed some kind of certainty. So there was a need to, yes, balance on the one hand the politics and the need for transformation and the need for redress, which really is at the heart of what is required in South Africa currently. But there was anxiety about if you do not have any kind of limitation that says that the process needs to be fully defined, then there were fears of capital flight. In the space where I am currently, I work with President Mbeki, as you know, at the Presidential Library. I have certainly, if you read the latest book that came out, the Thabo Mbeki that I know, at least a number of the contributors are saying, upon reflection, and at least quite a few of the politicians, who through my work I've come across, I have sensed that there's a sense that says, perhaps at the time we overstated the question of white fear and the question of, if you go too deep on the issue of land and economy at the time, that there was the whole thing, the concern about the implications for the economy. Certainly this is at least a political reason, as I understand it, for why the date was put there in the first instance. And 1913 at the time was chosen because certainly it was the first piece of legislation passed now by the Union of South Africa from 1910. And I really like the way that you've cut down, the different effort, which is true. South Africa before 1910 was actually two colonial states running one country. the Dutch, 2 Dutch republics, colonies if you like, and 2 English ones, British colonies. And in 1910, when the Union of South Africa was formed, the very first piece of legislation that they passed, and to that extent also it shows you to what extent how central the land question was to the colonialists even at the time, to say that the very first piece of legislation that we're going to pass is going to be legislation that deal with land rights. In many ways to consolidate and, if you like, to have a uniform way in which you deal with the native question, as they call it at the time, and the land question at the time. And therefore it was the very first piece of legislation passed by the Union of South Africa became that. And in terms of just having a sense of certainty, if you like, at least as far as land restitution is concerned, the date was chosen for that reason. Are there case studies from other parts of the world in terms of how this is dealt with? Certainly. The concept of Aboriginal title is used mainly by what we call the Council's countries, your Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. They're using the concept of Aboriginal title. In essence, that means that they recognize that fundamentally the inhabitants of the land have always owned the land from time immemorial, pre-colonial. So it's a concept that recognizes the validity of title to land to the pre-colonial time. So that's what they do in Canada, in Australia, and in New Zealand. They use this concept to say, we are going to recognize claims. And New Zealand is a good example because they have a similar system like we have. They have a Maori court that deals with claims of Maoris, and they also have a commission like we have, the commission based on the Treaty of Waitangi. So basically, like what they do is, we are going to recognize loss of territory and loss of land and loss of natural resources that the indigenous inhabitants of the country suffered because of colonialism. And in terms of international law, at the time this was allowed, they had a concept that they called terra nullius, which basically said that when the colonialists arrived at a country, they would just take the land because they believed that the land belonged to no one. And this was based on a very racist concept that said that because the inhabitants are so, the word that they used was uncivilized. Their land tenure systems were so uncivilized, and based on that, any first colonial power that arrives on a piece of land, they had the right to take the land. However, there's been a lot of changes. The International Court of Justice decided in 1975 in the case of Western Sahara to say that that very concept of colonial conquest, called terra nullius, of saying that the land did not belong to anyone. In other words, as long as it doesn't yet belong to a colonial power, it doesn't belong to anyone, which means you do not recognize the inhabitants, the indigenous inhabitants as civilized, etc. The International Court of Justice decided as far back as 1975 to say that that was a racist notion. And because it was racist, therefore, it can never be regarded as valid. So therefore, no one in the world should be able to say, I am claiming rights to this, or in other words, I'm dispossessing the indigenous inhabitants based on this concept. And this is what then has led to, in Canada and in Australia and in New Zealand, to them recognizing treaty rights and then being able to recognize land claims by Aboriginal, by the First Nations people, the natives of those countries, to be allowed to do that. So my short answer is, if we want to move on this question, perhaps we need to look at how this concept of Aboriginal title works, and that's the way in which you could deal with it. Is it desirable to have a date even in the Constitution? I suspect that those that are in economics and industry, etc., would say that it is necessary because we want some form of limitation, if you like, some form of certainty. The question was, you need to have certainty because you couldn't say suddenly all property. You do not recognize any form of property. So they were saying, yes, you are going to recognize the right to property, but you are going to allow the state to do land reform, but you're going to define to the extent to which you do it. 20 years later, maybe young people have found a mission to say we should look at that.
Thank you very much. South Africa is a land of compromises. In fact, South Africa is a shining example in the Constitution, limiting redress.
Thank you, Chair. I will just make a statement before I answer you. Just to expand on what Dr. Nzimande was talking about. Before I even go there, if you can tell what you were saying to Americans and the Spanish because of what they did to the Indians in America, that would be very good. But anyway, let's stick to what we are talking about here. The reason why, or one of the reasons why we are against this date, because it forms part of the Bill of Rights, and if people were dispossessed before 1913 and they can prove that, then it means that the subsection itself infringes upon the people who were dispossessed before 1913, infringes on their rights as the citizens of this country. So in order to avoid this happening in the future, we have come up with an argument that we don't need to put a date, because if you put a date on the Constitution and say that the cut-off date is 1800, the questions will come up to you and say, but we're dispossessed in 1652 by Jan van Riebeeck and his people, which is like perpetuating the same thing that we are complaining about right now. So I am of the argument that we don't need a date in the Constitution.
Well, thank you very much. She said, in fact, maybe we overstretched our imaginations in terms of the white fear. Right from the beginning of time until in the 1800s, right up to 1930, in fact, the belief was that Africans were subhuman. They were an uncivilized lot. In fact, they were just a notch above animals, specifically monkeys, gorillas, apes, and all of that. That is why it was taken that whichever European came into any piece of land, they were declared to be the first inhabitants of that land. Now we are in 2016. I'm going to pack it there as food for thought. As I request Dr. Bomani to have a bite, should there even be a date of cutoff in the Constitution?
It's a very important question, and even more important to comment after a young person has said we don't want a date. There shouldn't even be a date for that. But my input is, even though from an emotional point of view, it's important to reflect on this question, but also from the perspective of inclusion, which is one of the ideas of the National Development Plan, inclusion of everybody, and goes back to the Constitution. The issue of the date, 19 June 1913, calls for some reflection. But I want to argue that this notion of the fear around capital flight that my fellow panelists has referred to, that kind of framed the discussions way back as the Constitution was crafted in 1995-96. It's still alive today. Just think that December 2015, we're grappling with issues around South Africa being relegated to junk status and all that. And one of the key areas of uncertainty had to do with land reform policies, the limitations on land holdings and all that. So that is not an old question. Even 22 years post-democracy is still here with us. Probably as a society we need to find ways to say, are we willing to, face head-on the implications of such flight, such an impact on the economy? We collectively take suffering and ownership in the interest of a greater good around returning assets to the rightful owners. Should we achieve that commitment? I think this is what the Institute is trying to do with the mobilization process. Once you have reached that kind of awareness and commitment that is inclusive of everybody, the whole of society, then you can raise issues around, we don't even need a date, because there's collective ownership around transformation and land reform in the country. Right now, when we look at where we are as a country, our argument is that let us do best what has been provided within the 1913. Let's resolve the restitution cases, deal with land reform within the amendment cases, and we do that excellently, so that when we build, intensify an argument around extending or doing away with the 1913 date, we do that from a position of best practice.
Thank you very much. I think your last point should really be highlighted, that as we agitate for a change in the Constitution, the work should not stop. In fact, the Institute, as it mobilizes society, should take as part of its program to encourage society, or those who have already laid claims, to be active participants, to ensure that all claims from 1913 to date that are lodged, we increase the vigor to make sure they are resolved and resolved well.
Yeah.
Now let me just, I think at this stage we will give an opportunity to members that are here to have a bite. We begin in June 1913. I don't want to channel your thinking necessarily, but I'm just going to pick on 1-2 points in relation to the timeline of land dispossession. In 1817, Lord Charles Somerset meets the Nika, a Xhosa chief at the Kat River, and is forced to cede land between the Fish and the Geiskama rivers. In 1855, Resolution 159 adopted by the Transvaal government, it prohibits anybody who was not a beggar from owning land, and also prohibits Africans from having beggar rights. It means in the Transvaal, on that date, Africans were no longer citizens of the Transvaal. In fact, when they woke up the next day, they were pariahs in their own land. Fast forward to the period after the Anglo-Boer War. The Union of South Africa, on the 31st of